Usually with media training, we would probably do this over a day. You'd probably have 5 participants. You'd go through preparation material. This is 40 minutes. So there's going to be things in here that I kind of touch the surface of. If you have any questions about sort of other training that you'd like to follow up on, please let us know as well, because we can set up some more training. Yes, keep asking your questions. So, storytelling. I think we often hear the way people talk about storytelling, they make it sound like it's an art form, but actually it's something we do all the time. I think that the big thing is that we don't necessarily know that we're doing it. So I'd first ask you a question. Can you think of a time that you've used a story this week, and what were you trying to do with it? So, for example, maybe you used it in a sermon to talk through a passage from the Bible, but relate it to life. Maybe you were talking to somebody that is isolated at the moment, that isn't able to get out there, and you were sharing an experience with them. Maybe you were sharing hope. Maybe you're trying to dispel fear. All the time, we are telling stories and sharing experiences to help us connect with other people. And the human brain is inbuilt to remember stories. So actually, when we tell a story, rather than just a fact or a figure, we are much more likely to remember it and pass it on. And Jesus was a master storyteller. Why was he a master storyteller? Because he kept his messages simple. He knew that when he was speaking to different people, to tell them different things. And he knew that sometimes actions speak louder than words. In the Bible, there's between 600 and 800 stories. And I imagine that a lot of you sitting there today can remember a fair few of them. And that just shows the power of storytelling. So why are we talking about this today? Because it's about how we can identify stories that you're doing in your parish and how we can help you tell these stories so that other people know about it, so that people can come and join your community, or that you can raise awareness for a good cause. It's any one of those things. So what makes a good story? It's usually something new, or maybe something novel, different. It's always, but especially for parish stories, it's something local, it's something personal, and something visual. Jesus knew this. He often used metaphors, symbols, analogies, that kind of thing in his everyday stories that made it much more easy for people to relate to. So I had a look, and this is just 4 stories. So if I haven't covered your parish, I'm not trying to be rude, but I just had a quick look of what other stories that are in the news at the moment for some of our parishes. So we've got a great story about a couple in their 80s who are still living a really diverse life, still very much part of their church, you know, enjoying everything, but from afar and digitally. We've got working with faith groups. We've got this piece in Aldershot where 1,000 people signed up. And these are all great stories. I think the only thing is that I know that there are thousands more stories like this happening in our diocese, and we're not necessarily telling them. So what I'd love to do is try and help you. So just some of the things that I've heard about is night shelters staying open, food banks running out of churches, phone trees to isolated neighbours. It's right from the start. I actually, praise to St Mary's of Bethany, just got sent a press release that they're putting out today. They started a phone tree in 18th of March, right at the beginning, to make sure that their non-digitally able people were able to keep in contact. And now they're sort of publicising and using that network to talk about the National Initiative of Daily Hope. So that's a great example of where it's a slightly new tweak on an old story. So then we move to kind of how you develop your story, how you think through what it is and how you're going to tell it. Because before we jump to telling the media about it, we've got to work out what we're going to say. And this is just a sort of process that should help you decide kind of what you want to say and what makes sense. So it's really a brainstorm to start with. What are the facts? What are the details? What's happening? Who's involved? When's it happening? Where's it happening? Why is it happening? But then some of these kind of feeling, what do you want people to know, feel, and do? So how has this impacted people involved? How do people feel about this? And it's really getting into the detail of that. Then you try and draft something, and I won't lie, the first draft is never pretty. You will never expect to use it, but it's really helpful in terms of pulling your thoughts together and working out what you want to say. And then you can actually step back and go, right, what are the 3 main things that I want to talk about with this? So, you know, and often when you've pulled everything together, it can be quite clear that there's themes or there's something that's important above everything else. For example, in this presentation today, preparation is going to be the key theme. Then you can ask yourself, if in an ideal world, what would be the ideal headline for your story? What would you want this story to be about? How do you want it to be summarized? Do you need to simplify the language? So it's really common, and I know I do it from a comms perspective. We live in a particular world where things make sense to us. And then when you're talking to someone else, they're like, I don't really understand that jargon or that acronym, or I don't really get it that way. So it's thinking about what Jesus did, about talking to different people in different ways. So when he's talking to fishermen, he's having stories that make sense to them. And then make sure you have examples to back up your points. So metaphors, imagery, symbols. I would always recommend, whatever story you're trying to tell, have a really good photo. It has to be something that, you know, really sums it up. And then finally, the question is, where's this content going to go? So who should you contact, and where could it go? Now, we're in a really interesting time, because I'm going to go on to now the media landscape, but actually there's a lot of stuff that we can publish ourselves. So self-content, you know, self-publishing. So your social media channels and your websites are really important, because they're one way of getting your stories out there. Now, if I go to the next slide. If we talk about the media landscape, you have some options. So you've got your own channels, but you've also got radio and TV. You've got newspapers and magazines. You've got social media, and you've got websites. And now the social media may be the social media channels of a radio station or a website of a radio station, but they could also be an online blog or a social media influencer or something like that. So there is a lot of options out there. And I was trying to pull together actually some stats on what our media landscape looks like at the moment. So what do people want? But of course, we've hit an unprecedented time, and it has changed what people want. So the stats in here are for 2019. They won't be true anymore, but they're all that's out there at the moment. Literally all of the data gathering sites are saying that they are reviewing this right now, because literally COVID-19 has changed the way we do things. But I think there's still some learnings that you can see here. So you can see that 49%, nearly half, consume their news on social media now, rather than through a publication like a newspaper. But the TV still remains the most used channel. What's interesting though is that TV is not the most trusted channel. So it shows that there is kind of a change in the way we view channels and how they're used. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this, because I think it sets the scene that all of these channels have a use and all of these channels are relevant, but just being aware that in COVID-19 era, that actually these channels are probably becoming more relevant, especially the social media and online ones. So, as I said at the beginning, I could spend hours on this subject, and I'm sure you're pleased that I'm not. So today I'm going to focus more about preparation for if you were having an interview, rather than if you're writing for the press, because that's a very different skill. Writing a press release or sending a photograph and a photo caption are often the simplest form, and there are details on our website that I will send you afterwards on how to do this. And if anyone's interested, we could do something about writing for the press. But actually, this is about thinking about what's happened once we've reached out to the press and we've said, we've got this great story, would you be interested? What do we need to do? And coming back to my key message, preparation is everything. So if you accept an interview with print media, so when I say print media, I mean a journalist writing for a newspaper. Now that might be online, or that might be a daily print or weekly print. The big thing is make sure you have time to prepare. You're going to need to do some fundamental things. You're going to have to ask some questions, do some research, think big, and practice. So what do I mean by that? Right. It's always helpful when you go in for a conversation with a journalist, how long are they going to talk to you? And if they're not willing to set a time, you need to, because you're not giving them ultimate access to you for 3 days. You want to be really clear that, you know, I've got half an hour, let's sit down, that'd be wonderful, so that you can talk about what you want to do and you can set the boundaries of the interview. If they've approached you, it might be that they're interviewing other people on a subject. So it's good to know who else is being interviewed. And that will also inform, will it be part of their daily news schedule? Or is it going to be a wider feature, therefore published in a couple of weeks? And then you need to do your research. So who's going to read this? Do they know much about what you're going to talk about? If not, what kind of background information would be helpful to give? What's the journalist interested in? What have they written about in the past? And what questions do you think they will ask? And then this stumbling block for a lot of people is, what are the difficult questions that you don't want to answer? Because guarantee, if you don't want to answer it, someone's going to ask it. So at least to have thought through what you want to say and how to prepare for that. Because if you're prepared for it, you'll be able to cope with it. And hopefully they just won't even come near it. And then it's practice. So it's going back to, what are those 3 main points you thought about when you were creating the content? And what is the detail that can back up those points? So, follow Jesus's goal. What anecdotes, what stories, what metaphors, what symbols, what imagery can you use to help get your point across? And this looks the same for broadcast media. And in principle, it kind of is, but your audience is different. So, and this is the one that working with broadcast media, so TV or radio, is the one that makes people the most nervous. And that's why preparation, again, is everything. So if you accept an interview, it's these questions again. Ask questions, but they're slightly different. How long will you have? Will there be others interviewed? So could they interact with you? Will it be live? So it's literally going out to the audience directly. Or is it pre-recorded, in which case it could be edited, and therefore you might have a little bit more control over the content. Are you going to be there in person or over the phone? Probably not a relevant question in current era, but do you have a strong phone line? Do you have signal? All of these things are quite important to have thought about. Also, will it be repackaged for other stories? We've had incidents in the past where someone was interviewed once about a particular issue, but then it appeared throughout the entire day. Do research. Who's going to listen to it, watch it, read it? What's the journalist interested in again? What questions? Back to that difficult question as well, because nobody wants to stumble on live TV. And then practice your 3 main points. I think people get really nervous about this one, and my one sort of hope for you all is actually journalists are not out to get you. They are out to tell a story. And so that's why practice and preparation can really help you win your side of what you want to get across, while also helping them do theirs. Now, when we've talked about these, a lot of these are when you knew that something was happening. So you've planned to communicate about a particular story. It may be that a journalist contacts you and says, I'm doing a story on older church buildings and whether they're safe. That might be and in those instances, I'm not going to talk actually about the process here today, but I do have in the how-to guide how to handle that kind of situation. But again, the one thing I would say is never answer on the spot. It's always better to take down the details, take down the deadline. It's asking those questions And then it's giving yourself some time, even if it's 5-10 minutes, just to prepare a response, talk to the comms team, decide whether you're the right person to answer it, that kind of thing. So that then, you know, you're not put on the spot. So that kind of moves us into some tips for handling journalists and media. Now, this is a whistle-stop tour. We're going to talk about being a spokesperson, body language, some techniques to answer some difficult questions, and some interviewer styles. None of this is meant to scare you, and I really hope it doesn't. But if it does, and you know, you just want to tell us why, please do. But really, this is my aim here, is to equip you with the information so that you feel more in control, so that this shouldn't be scary. So, what is a good spokesperson? It's pretty self-explanatory, but somebody who's knowledgeable in the subject, who's empathetic and caring, competent, able to communicate clearly and succinctly, credible, honest, trustworthy, and calm under pressure. Which, that sounds like an awful lot to be, but actually that's what a lot of you are doing in your day-to-day lives. It's just about keeping those in mind. So, and that's where practice and preparation come in, because the more you practice, the calmer you feel, the more prepared you are, the more credible you can be. So all of these work hand in hand. And there's some avoids. So there's this, we typically say avoid using I, so talk about we. However, if you are giving a personal anecdote, clearly there is a time and place for when, you know, an I is appropriate. Avoid speculating. Again, in this current climate, speculation is kind of one of the main things going on at the moment. And actually, to deliver a message of hope, there needs to be a little bit of speculation. So with everything, there's always a pinch of salt required. Don't make promises you can't keep. We talked about jargon and acronyms. And when a subject is really close to your own heart, often we can become defensive when people ask questions about it. So it's just being aware of that so that you can remain calm. And another key thing is, don't repeat misinformation. So if a journalist asks you something and actually what they've asked you in the question is wrong, correct it. Because if you repeat it, they can use it even though it's misinformation. And I've found this from the BBC. Apparently speaking in front of an audience is one of the 5 most common fears. So I know a lot of you speak in front of congregations on a weekly, daily basis. So actually speaking to people shouldn't be something that's a fear. But I think even for a communicator, even for a vicar or somebody who's talking to people, it can be scary talking about a subject when you maybe feel someone in the audience is more equipped to talk about it, or you know, you're having a bad day. So it's just recognizing that sometimes it's okay to feel a bit of fear. So if we go into body language, this is always an interesting one, because as soon as you start talking about body language, everyone starts thinking about how they're sitting, what they're doing, all of that. And that's what I would say to you now. Just have a think now, what's your natural state? What's your natural body language? So, for example, I'm sitting on a swing chair, which ironically is not ideal to do a presentation, because I know that naturally I move quite a bit when I'm talking. I use my hands quite a lot. So I know, especially if I was doing a media interview, that I would have noticed the fact that this chair moves, and I probably would have gone and got another one just so it wasn't distracting. And that I probably might have even put one of my hands down my side just to kind of calm some of my mannerisms. But it's just having that awareness of what you do. Another thing I do is I nod. So if a journalist was asking me a question, you know, and it was negative, my nodding to it subliminally suggests that I am kind of agreeing with what they're saying, whereas actually what I'm saying is I am listening, I'm hearing you. So just take a minute to have a think about kind of what are the things you do. And I'll run through some of the body languages to think about. So there's eye contact. Now, it's really hard presenting on a Zoom where I've got a split screen because I've got a presentation, I've got a camera up, I've got kind of you on my screen in front of me. Where do I look? I might not even look as if I've been presenting to you at all. I might have been looking like I was looking out the window. So eye contact can be really important to building trust. Tone. If you believe what you say, often your tone is much more sort of subtle and soft. If you stumble over your words, which is ironic that I stumbled then, it can suggest that perhaps you don't. So it's an interesting one. Your posture, open arms, it's welcoming. If it's slouched, if you're folded arms, often it can mean like, don't come too near my personal space. Hands in sight is a sign of trustworthiness versus hands hidden. Facial expressions, body movements, mirroring someone else's behaviors all help put someone at ease. And then the clothes you wear, ironically, especially if you're on a broadcast media, so TV, probably not so much for radio because no one's going to see you, but being aware of what the background is that you'll be talking against. So I'm in a very white room. I was wearing a white shirt. I'm now wearing a black cardigan. Just being aware of how that can influence what someone will see and what's distracting. So the general rule is a kind of a blue or black shirt with either a plain tie, obviously white dog collar, and for women, no sort of distracting clunky jewelry or a really floral scarf that may sort of take your eyes away from, participation. So moving on to ways to answer questions in an interview. You've got your content, you know what your 3 big points you want to make, you have your examples, etc. Now there are some quick ways of handling a question that isn't quite what you're expecting or isn't quite what you want to answer with. So, and we call them, the first type is called bridging, which is an example. We use the ABC model, where you acknowledge the question that's been asked, you bridge back to use a bridging statement, such as like, what's important here or what we mustn't forget, and then you contribute your point. Another type is called flagging. So I've actually done this in this presentation. I flagged right at the beginning, if the one thing that you go today is about preparation. So that's an example, but a lot of people use it at the end. So they'll say, I think, we've talked about a lot today, but we should never forget the following points. And it can be really useful just to make sure that you're both on the same page when you're having a discussion. And then hooking. Now this is done by people who are very competent in what they're talking about. It's about sort of almost throwing in a fact or something really interesting that will stop your interview in the tracks, and they'll go, oh, maybe we could hear a bit more about that, or does that link in with this? So it's about having a piece of data, or that really fascinates them. And these are 3 types that are used. Now, I think the one thing I would point out with these is you want it to be a dialogue. You don't want to get to the end of the interview and the journalist be like, wow, you just repeated those 3 main points 9 times by bridging back to what you were trying to say. There needs to be some give and take. However, you don't have to always answer the question that's asked. You can use these techniques, but use them wisely. In the how-to guide that I'll share with you after this, I've put a link into a YouTube video of how not to do it, because there's some brilliant ones out there. There was the CEO of Adobe who was asked multiple times the same question and bridged back to something completely different, and he just looks like a fool. And that is an example of where it doesn't work, but it can be really critical in helping you through. And I thought I'd use a couple of examples just to show you how this could work in a kind of a church, a diocese, a parish setting. So I was thinking about what we might be going through right now. So the question the journalist might say is it true that funeral numbers are still so limited that it's preventing families from properly mourning? So that is something that potentially might get asked. Now, you might be, interviewing to talk about a community project that's going on to help those vulnerable, but this gets you get sidetracked with this. So your first point is acknowledging it. So government guidelines has stipulated the size of a funeral, and this is in order to curb the disease and to protect the vulnerable, and we are following this guidance carefully. And then you bridge. However, we've been working together with leaders of other faith organisations to establish bereavement support across Surrey for those of all faith and none. And then you give your message. So we've got clergy across our diocese in all 162 parishes who are willing to provide this support to those who need this, regardless of whether you're part of the congregation or not. And we're really hoping that people reach out. And if they do want to reach out, we've got this phone number. So that would be an example of where you use that technique. Another one would be, how much money has the Diocese of Guildford lost to COVID-19? I'm being controversial now. So your acknowledgement would be, it's too early to tell at this stage. Like everyone, this is an evolving situation. The bridge, what's important here is working with our parishes to understand who is most affected, how we can help each other, and how we can prepare. And then your message with backup, and this is obviously me talking as the diocese, amazingly, we are seeing some parishes pay their whole parish share in advance as they can, a symbol of Christian togetherness. So you've gone from a really negative question to a really positive answer. Now, obviously, with all of these situations, it really depends on what the interview was and how you are handling it. But it's just some example of a way to do it. So I don't know if I've been a good example of this today or not, but some of the key takeaways, just as we wrap up here, it's really important when answering questions to start with your point and then give your supporting messages. Don't go all over the place. Start with a big context building and then get to your point, because you might have someone's attention for the first bit. You've hopefully still got their attention at the end, but we all know minds can wander. So really important to start with your key point. Same with the press release. The first paragraph would always be everything you want them to know, like the main important detail. And then the rest is kind of the flowery bit. But it's still important, it's supporting it, but you've already delivered the piece that you want them to hear. And don't be afraid to repeat it. Often we get asked a question over and over again. And so it's really important, if that's your key message, keep saying it. Keep it simple, keep it short. I think it tells you everything. And then finally, I didn't know whether to end with this, but I am going to end with it. It's around interviewer techniques. And I'm not putting this up there to scare you, because actually I think some of these techniques are brilliant. It's just an awareness of things that anyone could do to perhaps make you say more than you want to. And that's why preparation and practice is so key. So these are some of the techniques that they use. So they might ask you a question like, well, I've heard that funerals are happening around the clock and that you can't even get into the system for months on end. Complete hypothetical. Well, actually, in that situation, that's an exaggeration, complete exaggeration. And the best thing to do is to tackle it head on. Well, I think you're exaggerating things a little bit there. Let's look at the facts. We've had an increase in funerals of 10%. So actually, we're all here to support everyone. There's a vicar in every parish. We are there for you. A hypothetical question might be, what happens if all churches are, Something that's completely out of there. And the thing to do with that is just to turn around and say, well, that's speculation, that's hypothetical. Let's look at what we have now. Another one is they might misquote you. So you may say something and they may sort of paraphrase it or misquote it back. It may not be intentional. And I think this is what's really important. A lot of these things are not because they're trying to catch us out. It's actually just because it's the way they see a situation. So it's really important to say, like, oh, I think you misheard me slightly there. What I actually said was this. And that's not being difficult. And if you do it in a calm and confident manner, you shouldn't be seen as such. And then there are some slightly more kind of aggressive ways of doing it. So they can bait you by constantly asking the same question, perhaps speeding up with their language. What do you think about this? I've heard this, and they're throwing it at you and you're like, whoa. So I think in all of situations like that, it's like, let's take one question at a time. The one I can answer today is this. And then interrupting you. So if you're constantly being interrupted, it's fair enough to say, I'm just gonna, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna finish this one point and then we can go to that question that you just asked, because I just feel that this is really important to finish on. So, and that's kind of the techniques, but usually, and in most of my experience in 15 so years, I don't find that you get these types of techniques used. Normally you just get somebody who's really interested, who wants to know as much as possible, and who will ask you some detailed questions because that's their job. And I think what we need to recognize is they're the professional, they're the expertise in what they're doing, and how can we support them? And it's kind of a bit of a win-win situation. So we walk into that situation going, this is what we want, and they're saying, well, we can turn that into a story for you if you give us some detail.